Good morning, everybody. We talked about a process yesterday, or last night, a process of transition from an old paradigm through a kind of a narrow place, a transition period to a new paradigm. And I suggested that we're just in the early stages of that transition period. That's why so many people are so negative. So many people are just frustrated, and there's a lot of anger. Now, a lot of us realize that anger and frustration don't take you where you need to go. But anger and frustration are necessary to help people kind of blast out of the old paradigm. If you think about it like a rocket, when the rocket's trying to escape the gravity of the earth, there's a lot of explosion, a lot of heat, a lot of sparks and all the rest. But eventually it gets out of the gravity of the old paradigm, so to speak, and it can start its journey to somewhere new. And that's what we'd like to talk about a little bit in this session. Again, the anger can be destructive, just like the explosion of that rocket could blow the whole thing up. But if it's directed, it can help you get to a better place. And that's what we'd like to talk about. I think this picture kind of tells a story. Here in Indiana, my guess is that just about every farm pond and every stream and river has a couple of snapping turtles in it. Now, this is not a normal snapping turtle. Some people found this poor animal crossing a road in New Jersey a couple springs ago. In fact, if you go to the next slide, you can get a top view of it. This is what it looked like from the top. Obviously, this is not a normal snapping turtle. What happened when this turtle was born, it was about the size of a $50. And it was swimming along in a pond somewhere. And apparently someone had taken one of those plastic rings from the top of a Gatorade bottle or something like that and thrown it in the water. The little turtle swimming along and happened to just get into that ring, so it was around its waist, just like a belt. But the turtle kept growing, and that plastic ring would not stretch, and so the whole animal has become distorted by this ring. The people who saw this turtle crossing a road, obviously they noticed it. They threw it in the back of their trunk and said, this is unusual. They knew something about snapping turtles. They knew that you almost never find a snapping turtle away from water unless it's the month of June, and the chances are if you find a snapping turtle away from water in June, it's a female going to lay eggs. Well, they looked at how distorted this animal is, and they thought, this could not be a fertile female. They took it to a veterinarian, they x-rayed it, and the entire back half of the animal was filled with eggs. So someone took it to his backyard, they let it go that night inside a fenced backyard, and sure enough, the turtle went that night and dug a hole with its back legs, deposited all of its eggs, and they thought, what an amazing thing. This animal's not only alive with this gross distortion, but it is also fertile. In fact, you can kind of imagine this was probably the hottest female turtle in the pond ever seen. It's kind of the Barbie of all turtles. And just as that image is destructive to human females, it's also pretty destructive here, because this animal weighs 8 or 9 pounds, but when it's full grown, it could easily weigh 25, 30 pounds. And so this ring that right now is just a distortion would eventually become the cause for the animal's death. In fact, it would be a very horrible death to imagine that plastic ring leaving a smaller and smaller circle as the bone gets thicker and thicker, that all of its vital organs, digestive tract, everything has to flow through. It would be a horrible death. And so these people did what any kind person would do. They said, we've got to save this animal's life, which is not easy because that head will come out and bite. They're pretty sharp jaws and pretty vicious. So they carefully, from the back, came and held the turtle down and took a pair of snips, and they cut that ring. And of course, as soon as they cut that ring, the turtle went, no, it didn't. It didn't change at all because that's solid bone. When they cut that ring, nothing changed at all, except that the animal at that moment had a future. Before they snipped it, it was a fatality in process. After they snipped it, it had the potential of a future. Now, probably when it's full grown, it will still be somewhat guitar-shaped, but it won't be a figure eight, and it will have the chance now to approximate healthy dimensions. Well, I'd like to suggest that this is a pretty valid image of what a lot of us go through. In fact, it's a valid image of what the Church of Jesus Christ goes through. we get constricted by some old ideas, ideas that are not part of the gospel. They're not part of our true identity, but they're ideas that we picked up along the way. We happened to walk into them, and they fit us and didn't cause us much trouble. And in fact, even now we could be holding these ideas, and we could still be fertile and healthy and doing just fine. And in fact, they could even be advantageous to us in some ways. But eventually, these ideas could constrict us and kill us. And so what we'd like to think about in this session is, if we're moving from a modern world and being modern Christians to this new world that we don't even know what to call it, so we call it postmodern, kind of like when they had first invented automobiles, they didn't know what to call them, so they called them horseless carriages. They defined them by what they weren't. As we enter this new territory and say, what would a new kind of Christian look like? I'd like to just very quickly, if you're taking notes, I almost suggest you don't even bother trying to copy all these down. This is in a book I have out there called The New Kind of Christian, if you're interested in more detail. But I'd like to just suggest to you what it is that we have to snip and what we have to leave behind and what it might be that we're moving toward. And that's what we're going to do just very briefly. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail here except to kind of mention these very briefly. I think we move from a world of an old ring of conquest, control, and progress. The idea that we had, it's very related to imperialism, to the spread of empire in the modern era. We had this idea that everything that was not us needed to be conquered and controlled and made like us, you see. And so, in the modern missionary movement, along with all the great things that happened, also what went along with it was a lot of European culture. So where people accepted the gospel, they also accepted European culture. And it plays out in 1,000 different ways in different places around the world. But there was the attitude of empire and conquest. And it's even in our language. We speak of blanking souls for Christ. Now, the whole souls thing is interesting, but blanking souls for Christ. How do you fill in the blank? Winning souls. It's like conquest, you see. What do we call it when a group of people come to a city and they want to win a lot of souls for Christ? We call it an evangelistic crusade. You hear the language. It's the language of conquest. And as we move into a postmodern world that's post-conquest, we move into a world that's interested, instead of conquering, it's interested in conserving. Let me just give you an example of this. How many of you remember after the Taliban was in control of Afghanistan, this Muslim extremist group went to eastern Afghanistan where there were pre-Islamic Buddhist statues carved in a mountain, a lot like Mount Rushmore. And the Muslims said, we've got to eradicate these vestiges of pagan Buddhism, and so they blew up the statues. How many of you remember that, seeing it in the news? Let me ask you this, honest question. How many of you feel that it was wrong to blow up those Buddhist statues? Now, isn't it interesting? You feel, as Christians, that it is right to conserve the artifacts of another religion rather than eradicate them. To that degree, you already are postmodern. You have a different attitude toward culture that's saying, don't wipe it out and eradicate it and replace it with ours, but rather enter it and redeem it and conserve everything that's good in the name of Christ. It's a very, very different approach. And it will affect the way that we do evangelism and the way we do ministry in our world. Very significant. We could talk about how the modern world was mechanistic and reductionistic. It liked to reduce complex things to simple mechanisms. And so we do this with the gospel. We have little booklets and tracts that explain the gospel as 4 laws or 5 steps or whatever. Our sermons tend to do the same thing. We like to reduce things into mechanisms. In fact, if you know the 4 spiritual laws, which again is extremely helpful for modern people, it's extremely unhelpful for postmodern people usually, for a whole series of reasons. But how does it start? Have you ever heard of the 4 spiritual laws? You open up the first page and it says, just as there are physical laws or mechanisms which control the physical world, there are spiritual laws. That was great news to modern people. They like to think in terms of simple mechanisms. Postmodern people, you go to them and say, look, I've got a little 20-page booklet here that explains all the mysteries of the universe as simple mechanisms. They reach for the air flight sickness bag because it makes them feel nauseous. They don't want you to reduce the mystery